She is both enrolled in both the School of Psychology and Applied Behavior Analysis programs. So when we talk about behavior, she really understands and really gets it, and can't wait to see her work and all of the work she's done today. So Mrs. Alexandria has an interest in research that broadly relates to equitable school discipline practices and minimizing the discipline gap. And what a timely, I guess it's very timely for this time. And she's done a lot of great work with students and families already, and will be sharing that with us today. The other parts and pieces of her practice and research relates to classroom management and behavior interventions to prevent the use of exclusionary discipline practices, which we know is of utmost importance right now. Since 2018, she has been a member of the PBIS Center of Equity Work Group, and she collaborates with national leaders promoting equitable decision-making within the PBIS framework. We have recently partnered with Mrs. Alexandria to do some work at the Minnesota Department of Education, and she's currently working in collaboration with us to work on some of our statewide goals and outcomes for students and families on some of our work groups. So we're excited to have her working with us as well. So today's presentation, she'll be presenting on, and we'll talk more in depth about this, the Culturally Responsive Field Guide. This is a brief that came out in May of 2019. And although it is about a 50-page brief, that can be found on PBIS.org, our National Technical Assistance Center. You will also see that in the chat. Although it's a little bit longer, it is full of resources and how schools can support more culturally responsive outcomes for students, families, and the community. The audience and the brief was really designed for assisting trainers and coaches and leadership teams, but do take a look at it because it's got a wealth of information and resources, including the tiered fidelity inventory that relates to culturally responsive ways to implement your school-wide PBIS core features. Within the brief, there are some guiding principles, and this will be discussed a little bit more. And again, take a look at the brief when you get a moment. But the guiding principles for school personnel to really think about is, we know that behavior is learned and it is context specific. So in environments at school and environments at home, in the community, behavior is learned, and we can do things to make changes to behavior with prevention and different changes and specific approaches. One of the other guiding principles is that there are shared beliefs and behaviors that serve purposes. So if we don't take a minute to understand or take some time to really dig into understanding various cultures and contexts, it's difficult to really understand families and students' shared beliefs and behaviors. And any number of cultural groups may engage or not engage in a shared specific behavior, depending on the situation or cultural appropriateness, as Dr. LaSalle mentioned earlier in her presentation. And just lastly, I wanted to touch on a quick few highlights that we don't need to redefine cultural responsiveness. It's defined, as Dr. LaSalle mentioned in this brief, that we want to make sure we include the following core components: that all have an identity and people feel included with their identity, that folks have a voice, including students and families and our school staff and environments, that we are supportive of all, and we remember to use situational appropriateness, as various cultures have to shift in and out of this at different times. And then there's really an emphasis on using data to support equity. And Alexandria will be discussing this more in her presentation. So sorry to be long, but I wanted to make sure I discussed the culturally responsive field guide, and please take a look at that when you get a moment. I will turn it over to you, Mrs. Alexandria Robers.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hopefully it helps people contextualize the information that I'll be presenting today. So once again, hello everyone. My name is Alexandria Robers, and today I'll be talking about establishing preliminary evidence for culturally responsive PBIS, the personal matrix activity. So I wanted to provide an introduction as to some of the background and to explain some of the reasoning how this project came about. And it sounds like you all have already been discussing cultural responsiveness and the field guide. So when I was initially doing this project, the field guide wasn't updated yet. So you'll see the citation Leverson et al. 2016, but there is an updated version now from 2019. So when thinking about what cultural responsiveness is, it includes holding high expectations for all students. And so really understanding that you don't necessarily have to move the goalpost or the finish line to make it easier, but you can change up the path to allow students to achieve the goals that we would like to see everyone achieve. And then also understanding students' cultures and experiences to enhance their learning. And so, not assuming that the standard curriculum and approaches will automatically map on or align with the lived experiences of every student. And so, that's just important when thinking about the cultures that and experiences that your students are bringing into the classrooms and into the school. Also providing all students with access to effective instruction and adequate resources for learning. And so how do we know when instruction is effective? Like definitely understanding the importance of assessment and data, and not necessarily for the individual student or teacher, individual teacher accountability, but for accountability within a school system. And so that can be helpful to contextualize the purpose of data collection and assessment in that way, because these systems, like both students and teachers exist in them, and it can be helpful to just making sure you're assessing it, but then trying to make it better for everyone who exists in those systems. And then finally, this quote serves as a conclusion when thinking about cultural responsiveness, especially as it relates to PBIS, but that school-wide PBIS is not fully implemented until it is culturally responsive. And so there is, a lot of thoughts out there that PBIS in and of itself like really should be culturally responsive. And so some people probably wouldn't disentangle those two things. However, for this presentation, I do. So I do talk about culturally responsive PBIS as a fairly distinct way and approach from like standard ways of going about implementing PBIS in schools. So why is cultural responsiveness within PBIS necessary? Some of these images and thoughts may be familiar to you already, but when thinking about equality versus equity, so providing everyone the same thing, equality, like that image shows, versus providing everyone what they need, equity. And so just being a bit more nuanced about what we're doing in a school and within our PBIS system, and having a cultural responsiveness lens can really help with that. And also acculturation versus assimilation. And so are we expecting everyone in our school building to automatically buy into what our values are, like as the admin team or just as like a larger like school body, or are we willing to incorporate differing cultures and differing values and be adaptable in how our school culture works? And then with the discipline gap, that is the phenomenon where students from certain racial and ethnic backgrounds are more likely than other students, oftentimes than white students, to be experiencing exclusionary discipline practices. And even when PBIS is implemented, these disparities still persist. So it is needed to have a differing approach or a way to enhance cultural responsiveness and ideally address this gap. So I like including this quote. It comes from one of the original developers of PBIS, and it states that to maximize the outcomes of evidence-based practices that are included within a PBIS framework, schools must implement with fidelity. And then it says that the implementation can be enhanced further by considering the cultural context and learning history of everyone in the school. So students, families, faculty, community members. And I believe this quote really emphasizes that, the traditional PBIS framework in and of itself does not include culturally responsive components, or those components are insufficient. And so really being intentional in this work to really enhance implementation of PBIS by considering the different cultural contexts and learning histories of everyone who will be living in the system and experiencing life in that system. So I just think it's really important to keep that in mind. And so how we go about actually engaging in implementation of PBIS through a cultural responsive lens, it might seem like a vague or abstract idea, but there are resources to help make the process a bit more pragmatic and concrete. And that includes this field guide, which was mentioned during my introduction here. And so the core components outlined in this field guide of culturally responsive PBIS include identity, which is the need to understand your own identity and how that impacts your practice in classrooms, as well as the identity of students and their families and the community, and how that impacts the identity of a school. And then voice. So students and families should have the opportunity to see themselves, their culture, values, and their histories in the school setting. So again, not automatically assuming that students are seeing themselves like in the school or in the culture or feeling that that school culture aligns with their culture outside of the school setting. And then having supportive environments. So prioritizing a positive school culture where everyone in the building understand a unified school mission to create an environment where students feel valued and supported, versus people creating their own individual systems, which can happen. It's really needed to be united in that way. And her situational appropriateness also earlier in the introduction, but keeping in mind the ability to alter one's behaviors depending on like the setting or the context the individual might be in. So this relates to something called code switching, and just important just to keep in mind that that's a burden and oftentimes people from minoritized backgrounds have to carry. And then finally, data for equity. So ensuring that teams prioritize the collection and evaluation of two types of data. So student outcome and the fidelity of implementation. So, and with these different components, I will be talking specifically about a research study I conducted with an activity from this field guide. And I just wanted to highlight these three components. So, because I believe the activity really maps on well to these three in particular. So voice, supportive environment, and situational appropriateness. Okay, so like I alluded to, I will be talking about a specific activity, but please know that the field guide includes a lot of information for other components of culturally responsive PBIS for teams and leaders to look at and hopefully enhance implementation of their current PBIS systems. And so the first recommendation of the field guide goes to the identity component, but really looking at identity awareness. And so understanding really like your own identity and how that can influence what we prioritize as a school. So whether that's what our school-wide behavior expectations are, or how we decide we're going to recognize or reinforce those expectations, really just taking a critical eye and how our identity is influencing that. And that also they have a cultural responsiveness companion for the tiered fidelity inventory. So for the common implementation fidelity measure, and teams can use this to really understand what part of their PBI systems can they enhance and can they make more culturally responsive. And so it can serve as a great discussion point, but can also serve as a great way to make an action plan to actually get these things to happen. And then the final selected component is really, I wanted to highlight the disaggregation of discipline data because disproportionality is so persistent in our education systems that it's really, really important for teams to take the time and disaggregate their data and really understand, who are our students who are part of groups or identities or backgrounds who are most likely to experience, certain outcomes, especially related to exclusionary discipline. Okay, so now I want to just really highlight the personal matrix activity and where it came from. So we did come from the field guide, which I've been talking about. And I highlighted or I included the three components of CRPBIS, which I really feel like the activity maps on well to. And then knowing that the field guide does contain a number of recommendations, but they are almost all informed by research. And when I was initially reading through this, I found that problematic because, especially in my field of school psychology, we're really interested in investing, our limited resources in things that we are fairly confident are effective for students. And so just by not knowing, not having any empirical evidence either way of saying, do these activities work? Like, are they beneficial? Like, how are they perceived by students, by teachers and staff? And so the ultimate goal for this research project, which I'll describe, was to ideally begin shifting this literature of culturally responsive PBIS from being research informed to being more evidence based. So I will just really briefly go over this, just knowing that with PBIS, there are recommended practices in particular to teach, recognize, and reinforce and remind students of school-wide behavior expectations. However, those expectations don't automatically map on to the lived experiences of students or maybe even teachers in a school building. And so how can we be responsive to that? And so culturally responsive PBIS really serves as a way for people to really be thinking about that type of enhancement of PBIS implementation. And so the purpose of the published study was to examine the effects of the personal matrix activity on the class-wide behaviors of culturally and linguistically diverse students. And before I talk about the actual activity, just wanted to quickly put up my research questions. So I wanted to know if there was a functional relationship between implementing the personal matrix activity and improvement in class-wide behaviors of culturally and linguistically diverse students. And then also looking at social validity questionnaires for both teachers and students, and if they perceive the activity as feasible, acceptable, or understandable. Okay, so now with my method, here is the personal matrix activity from the Leverson Field Guide. And so how the personal matrix activity works is that in your first column, you have your school-wide behavior expectations that's filled in. And the second column is also filled in where it says at school, it looks like. And so knowing what your school-wide behavior expectations are, and then knowing what that actually looks like in a school are already completed. And then the next two columns are actually left blank and are for students to fill in. And so when I did this, I had to be at the class-wide level, so we all did it as a group. But depending developmentally with the students, this can also be done with individually. Students can fill it out on their own. So I can just go over one example. If the school-wide expectation is to be safe at school, that can look like keep hands and feet to self, or tell an adult if there's a problem. And that can maybe be in conflict with what the behavior expectation is at home as it relates to being safe. So protecting your friends and family, well, maybe that means I don't keep my hands and feet to myself. Or in my neighborhood, it could be, you look the other way, you stick up for your friends. And so maybe that goes in conflict with telling an adult if there's a problem in my neighborhood. So really just trying to understand, where are there similarities across the context in which students live in terms of the behavior expectations, and where are there conflicts. And so really communicating with students and saying, this is why we keep our hands and our feet to ourselves at school, and that's why we're saying that's how you be safe. Like at home, maybe you don't have to do that, but at school, this is what we do. And then explaining why, but not trying to say like one's better or one's worse, just trying to really highlight that there can be differences, but then helping children and students like problem solve how they can reconcile those differences. And here's what it looked like in my study. So the acronym at the school-wide behavior expectation acronym at the school was PRIDE, and it's all listed out there what that meant. And then I went in for 3 days. And the first day we filled in the first column. So at school, it looks like, to make sure students really understood what the expectations were at school. And then for the second column, we did that the next day and invited students to really tell me how it was at home. And then I referred back to the school column and talked about, oh, well, for some people it's the same. And, for some it might be different. And then did the same thing on the third day and the final day with the in my neighborhood, and then talked about all three columns to summarize it. And I just noticed the chat, so I'm going to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. Looks like we're okay. So here is a quick view of the characteristics of my participants. And so majority of whom were English language learners whose primary language was Somali, and most of them were Black and male. And so there were 4 classrooms. 3 of the 4 were first grade classrooms, and there was 1 fourth grade classroom. And the primary outcome measure for the study is called the Direct Behavior Rating Single Item Scale, and it was used to assess the class-wide behavior change. And for this measure, teachers identified a period of time when they perceived their class-wide behaviors to be most problematic or at their most highest. And then during that specific time, each day of the week, the teacher was instructed to observe their class-wide behaviors and then record it on this measure. So not looking at individual students, but really class-wide, what were the class-wide respectful behaviors, what were the class-wide disruptive behavior. And additional outcome measures included a pre-post knowledge questionnaire to really understand how students understood the school-wide behavior expectations before the activity and how much that changed after going through the activity. I also looked at office discipline referrals to understand if there was any change in that. And at the school, they did majors and minors, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. And I also had 2 versions of social validity questionnaires, one for students and one for teachers. Okay, so for my results, the first one I'll describe is for my primary outcome measure, which was that DBR, the Direct Behavior Rating Single Item Scale. And so know that for respectful behavior, teachers were operating from this definition. So respectful behavior was compliant and polite behavior in response to adult direction, inter-peer interactions, or inter-interactions with peers and adults. And so following teachers' directions, pro-social interactions with peers, a positive response to adult requests, and a verbal or physical disruption, but without a negative tone or a negative connotation. So that's how respectful behavior was defined. And so specifically for the first classroom, classroom A, the average class-wide respectful behavior during baseline was 41%, and that increased to 61% during the intervention phase. And visually, data were more stable during the intervention phase, and the highest occurrence of respectful behavior was observed during the intervention. And for the second classroom, classroom B, the average class-wide respectful behavior during baseline was 28%, and then increased to 78% after the intervention. Visually, data were stable across phases with more variability towards the end of the intervention phase. But again, the highest occurrence of respectful behavior were observed during intervention. And then a similar change was observed for the third classroom, or classroom C, and that the average class-wide respectful behavior during baseline was 55%, and this increased to 80% during intervention. Visually, data were variable across phases, and the highest occurrence of respectful behavior, again, were observed during intervention. And so the last classroom, classroom D, continued the trend observed in the previous 3 classrooms, where the average class-wide respectful behavior during baseline was 36%, and then this increased to 78% during intervention. Visually, data were variable across phases, and high occurrences of respectful behavior were observed during both baseline and intervention phases. And so noticeable change in level with the positive trend was observed across all of the classrooms. And that's what we wanted to see, because that means that the class-wide respectful behaviors were increasing over time. For disruptive behavior, the definition teachers were operating from is that disruptive behavior is any action that interrupts regular school or classroom activity. So being out of your seat, fidgeting, playing with objects, acting aggressively, talking or yelling about things that are not related to classroom instruction, that was disruptive behavior. And so when looking at the graphs, for the first classroom, classroom A, the average class-wide disruptive behavior during baseline was 69%, and that decreased to 44% during the intervention phase. Visually, data were more variable during baseline, but more stable during the intervention phase, and the lowest occurrences of disruptive behavior was observed during intervention. For the second classroom, the average class-wide disruptive behavior during baseline was 78%, and that decreased to 23% after the intervention. Visually, data were stable during all phases, and the lowest occurrences, again, of disruptive behavior occurred during intervention. And then a similar change was observed for the third classroom, classroom C, and that the average class-wide disruptive behavior during baseline was 70%, and then that decreased to 34% during intervention. And visually, data were variable, but the lowest occurrences of disruptive behavior, once again, was observed during the intervention. And then finally, the last classroom continued the trend that's observed in those previous 3 classrooms, where the average class-wide disruptive behavior during baseline was 75%, and that decreased to 37% during intervention. Visually, data were stable across all phases, with the lowest occurrences of disruptive behavior observed during the intervention phase. And so overall, there was a noticeable change in level across the classrooms with a negative trend, which is what we wanted to see because this indicates that class-wide disruptive behaviors were decreasing over time. And my pre-post knowledge questionnaire, I'll talk about results from that, but just know that a total of 64 students completed this interview questionnaire for both the pre and the post time points. And so the first, let me explain that. So the first question we asked students was what the school rules were at that school. And we were expecting them to say the behavior acronym. We wanted them to say PRIDE. So that's what we were saying for. So 42% of the 64 students before the activity were able to say PRIDE. Like that's what our school rules are. It's PRIDE. That increase in nearly doubled to 81% after the activity, where students were able to say PRIDE. That's all we just wanted them to say, that they knew that those are the school rules. And so before the activity, of the 27 students who could identify, who could say PRIDE, only 9 could actually say the specific behavioral expectation of the acronym. So we wanted them to say that it was preparation, responsibility, integrity, determination. Like we wanted them to say all excellence, like all of them. And so of the 27 who could say PRIDE, 9 of those, or 33%, could list out each actual behavior expectation from the acronym. And then after the activity, of the 51 who could say PRIDE, 39 or 76% could correctly identify each specific behavior expectation. And then finally, we wanted them to provide a relevant example so we would ask, what does preparation look like? And we wanted them to provide a relevant example describing what that behavior expectation actually was. And so of the 9 who could list out each part of the acronym, all of them could provide a relevant example for each of the school-wide behavioral expectations. And then of the 39 who actually was able to say each of the behavior expectations, 85% or 33 students were able to provide a relevant example for each school-wide behavioral expectation. Okay, and just before I get to majors and minors, so at this school, a student received a major when the teacher perceived the behavior to be something that immediately sent the student out of the instructional environment, or if a student received 3 minors, then they got a major. And a student received a minor when the teacher perceived the behavior to be something that they could handle in the instructional environment. However, it was still necessary to document it. And so the first one I have here are just like accounts. So how many majors were reported per week before the intervention and after the intervention. And so the number of majors per week between baseline and intervention actually increased, whereas the number of minors per week between baseline and intervention actually decreased. So there were differences in what we found depending on if it was a major versus a minor. And so a similar pattern is seen here where we looked at the 3 most common types of majors received per week. And the 3 most common types of majors were defiance, disrespect, and physical aggression. And so with these types of majors, they either increased between baseline and intervention or they stayed the same. This is in contrast to minors. And so the most common types of minors received per week were defiance, disruption, and disrespect. And so all of those decreased between baseline and intervention. And so a total of 49 students um, responded to the social validity questionnaire, and then all teachers responded to the social validity questionnaire. And so students, majority of whom found the personal matrix activity to be easy, helpful, fun, exciting, and almost 80% said they would participate in it again. And then all teachers reported that the activity was understandable and acceptable. And I included this quote from a teacher, so I always like to include qualitative data as well. She said that my only negative feelings towards this is that I feel my students know what to do and say, but they don't make the choice to follow the expectations they know. Talking about it is important, but how do we get kids to actually take ownership and actually do what they say? And so that's just really acknowledging that with this activity, it is really making sure that students fundamentally understand the school-wide behavior expectations and how that can be different. And so it is a lot about like talking about the behavior, just learning about those behavior expectations. And what I feel like what the teacher is getting at is more about like the consequences, like how can we make sure that we're reinforcing students actually following what our school-wide behavior expectations are. And so that's not necessarily the purpose of this activity, but it's definitely something to think about moving forward and maybe like expanding upon after implementation of the personal matrix activity. And so for my discussion, from this study, the personal matrix activity did improve the class-wide respectful and disruptive behaviors of diverse students. And there was results supported that the personal matrix activity was a tier 1 intervention. And that really comes from what was happening with the data from those majors versus minors. So we saw an improvement in minors. And so it can just, we can like think that if a child engaged in a behavior that was deemed to be worthy or whatever, like as a major, then they probably need behavior supports and interventions beyond tier 1. And so just recognizing that what the personal matrix activity was designed to do and what it actually did in this study, but there is support for it to be more used at a tier 1 level. And so both teachers and students perceive the activity as acceptable and understandable. So there is social validity evidence supporting the use of the personal matrix activity in this study. And this is the first study that we know of to empirically evaluate this activity. And so, yes, more research is definitely needed to see if results from the present study will hold with different populations and different contexts. And so really keeping in mind that effective culturally responsive practices need to be identified through research, but then also implemented in practice. Okay, and so just really wanting to highlight some of the things that we already talked about, but just know that I did, talk about the personal matrix activity most of the time. That's what I looked at in this research study. However, there are other research-informed recommendations from this field guide for teams to, look at and consider if it would be a good fit for their own PBIS system. And so really like that first piece is that identity awareness. So really thinking critically about whose voices are we promoting? Are we spotlighting? Another way to think about it is like, who are we making comfortable? And so just really being just a little bit more critical about that as a whole, like everyone in a school building. Something someone says about like this activity, it seems like it really puts it on like the kids need to, learn how it's different in different contexts, but what about the adults? And that's true too. Like everyone can really be a part of this. And I think identity awareness is a really good place to start with that. And then also I already talked about the cultural responsiveness companion, but if PBIS systems and people are already using the TFI, that's a great supplement to really further evaluate what part of our systems can we enhance our cultural responsiveness for. And then also seeking feedback from everyone in a school community. And so school staff, students, families, community members is really, really important and key to make sure that we are incorporating everyone's voice and what they like, and making sure that they are also able to see themselves in some way in that school culture. And another recommendation from the field guide was to include families and community members as teachers of behavior expectations. And this can also supplement what's happening with the personal matrix activities. So just further, acknowledging that behavior expectations in school might be different, might be the same in other contexts, but really situating it and explaining why certain things happen in a school, or why like these are our behavior expectations, why we are prioritizing this like as our school can be really helpful. And then there's an approach in the field guide called Validate, Affirm, Build, and Bridge, or the VAB approach. And this can be really helpful for folks who are, doing the personal matrix activity, and there are a lot of differences, but just, again, making sure we're not trying to say one way's better or one way's worse, like just different. And so how can we make sure that we're being supportive and bridging more than dividing? And so lastly, because it's always so important, but examining trends in this aggregated data, because more often than not, disproportionality in discipline practices does exist. And so it's just important to know how that's playing out within a particular school and their system. And so, yeah, there's recommendations in the field guide to support with that as well. So I definitely want to leave time to answer any questions or discuss any main points. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandria. This is Janet again from MDE. We do have plenty of time for questions. I know I have a few, but I'll let others go ahead and ask those questions first.
Hey, this is Eric Luce. I've got a quick question for you. What time of year did you do the personal matrix activity? And if you were thinking of making this like a standard practice within a school, every time they get a new group of students in it or a new grade every year, what would be your recommendations for when in the school year you might undertake this?
That's a great question. I'll answer the first one. So I did this activity between October and December of the school year. And I would recommend doing it earlier rather than later. So even like September, I think would be a good time. And I know like most of my classrooms were first grade. So like all of them had like been in the school for at least a year already. But I do think it's something that regardless of the grade and regardless of how long a student has been in the system, for schools to take it on and do it like with every grade, like every year, as a reminder and as a way to facilitate discussion, and especially as also like developmentally as kids change and thinking about the behavior expectations more critically across their different contexts. So that's why I think it would be helpful to do it with everyone sooner rather than later. It's like September, but I did it in October and November, and by December everyone was in the intervention phase. But yeah. Very much.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll go ahead with my question. This is Janet again. So I think it's great that you had some, ideas for further research and things that you might do differently or encourage. And one of those things that we see statewide is, according to our TFI scores in all regions, is that we really want to continue to improve our work with students, families, and the community. And that's been a gap for some time. And I think just going through the pandemic and seeing how much schools have highlighted the importance of engaging families in the community, it's really improved. I guess, so my question is just a little bit more of an anecdotal question. Knowing the families that you worked with and many that were Somali, were you able to, and I know you had to get consent for research and that kind of thing, but were you able to engage with families and have sit down conversations and get to know some of them a little bit more? Or was that a barrier to talking with families and parents?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. In the context of this research study, I did not, but in the setting in which the study took place, I was on the PBIS leadership team at that school at the time. And I mean, it was earlier in my training, and I was in hindsight, I'm actually very surprised that we did not have anyone from the community or family come in. I know that's part of, tier one, like they recommend that they're on like the leadership team. And that was something we were always talking about, but in that particular system, it never happened. And so it would be very fascinating to really understand how do families perceive the school-wide behavior expectations, and really asking them if they're seeing any conflicts between home or when they're out in their community. I know this is really there to facilitate discussions like with students, but I do think that would be a great expansion of this work and of this project and of use of this activity, is to really meaningfully engage and incorporate the voice of family and community members. But that's definitely not something that was happening in that particular system. And I mean, it's a limitation, and like I fundamentally believe that everyone's doing the best that they can do. But I think, especially like nowadays, I'm hopeful that more people will really meaningfully incorporate those voices, because we know it's so important in supporting students, especially when it relates to behavior, when it can be more subjective than it probably should be. So, yes.
I think we have a question from Sarah Fisher. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, thank you. I just have a question referencing back to the slides when you were talking about your study and the results. There were two vertical lines that kind of moved gradually to the right. And I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit more about what those vertical lines meant. Is that like the length of the intervention, or just kind of just looking for some clarity on the significance of that?
Definitely. Is it this slide, Sarah?
Yeah, well, or both of them.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I can explain that for sure. So this was a single case research design. It's more specifically a multiple baseline design across classrooms. And so what these lines are, it's called like phase lines. And so it's just to indicate at what point in time this classroom was in. This classroom, this is their baseline, but in this classroom, this is their baseline. It's a bit longer. And then this classroom, they have the longest baseline and the shortest intervention. And the inverse is true for up here. So they had the shortest baseline and the longest intervention phase. And so what happened is I just had the teachers, they were instructed every day of the week to fill out that DBR, that direct behavior rating scale that I mentioned. And they did that during all of these phases. And so the lines are just to indicate in which phase the teachers collected the data. And so this was the baseline phase, which nothing happened, like I didn't go in or anything. So that's just the baseline phase, like they did what they did. And then this is our intervention teaching phase. And so these were the 3 days that I came in and did the personal matrix activity. And then this is the intervention post phase. So this is after, like, we did the activity, like I didn't come back and do anything else, but I still told teachers to continue to collect that data until the end of the semester. So through December. So hopefully that helps contextually explain that.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much for explaining that. And just kind of a follow-up question to that. Was there any noticeable difference between when the intervention was implemented? Like if you had more baseline data versus more intervention data, like was there a significant difference between like how much positive or negative results came from, like as a result? If that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does. That's a great question. I did not see that. I did not, and that's why it's sometimes helpful to look at it overall, like across the classrooms, what was happening. Sometimes you can look at individual classrooms, that's fine too. But with this particular research design, really trying to see if there's if you're replicating your effects. And so regardless if it was classroom A or classroom C or classroom D, just the trend was after I went in for those 3 little days or whatever, teachers were reporting that they had like lower levels of class-wide disruptive behavior and then higher levels of class-wide respectful behavior. And so that's why this design is really helpful from a research standpoint, because there's a lot that can be happening in a school across some months. And so just knowing that, whether, so at this school or in this classroom in particular, like they were probably in intervention for sure by like mid-October, compared to like down here, like I think it was like right after like the Thanksgiving holiday or something like that. So just really trying to see, despite the changes that are going to happen over time, can we still replicate these findings? And so the data supported that we were able to, and that's just a strength of this design. So regardless of how long or how short any particular like phase is, can you replicate what you found in the previous phase?
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Great question.
We still have 10 more minutes for questions if anyone else would like to ask any specific questions.
And I had one more as other people are thinking about it, but I was just thinking about as you get this really individualized responses back, I know there are a number of teams that, 5 years down the road really want to revisit their school-wide expectations and make updates and revisions. How can you see data from this sort of an activity and process that stretches home, community, and, for getting the sort of feedback that may not have been available when this started to consider in terms of making updates and revisions to that school-wide expectations?
That's a great question. Yeah, I love that. You're already there thinking about that. I think, especially when thinking about voice and whose voice we're prioritizing or we're recognizing, and who are we making comfortable in those things. I think a lot of times people can have really good intentions, but that doesn't mean you have good outcomes. And this can be a really great way to start critically examining that and meaningfully examining that. And when you initially, develop behavior expectations, like there are only so many acronyms out there. At least I haven't seen too many different ones. Sometimes people surprise me, but I think having information from students, but also like how their, experiences at home and community influence their understanding of what behavior expectations are, it can meaningfully like change those initial behavior expectations in the way that they were developed, because we can have blind spots sometimes. And for this school in particular, a lot of their students are English language learners, and the PRIDE acronym is a bit, I don't know, it's a bit wordy, and like integrity, and I don't know, it was just some big words in there. And I don't necessarily know if the original developers of the school-wide behavior expectations like necessarily thought that through in ways which they probably might have if they had something like the personal matrix activity more guiding their decision making. And so, yeah, even if you need to come back like after some time, like these were our school-wide behavior expectations, now we think we really should be adapting and modifying them. I do think the personal matrix activity is a great place to start, a great resource for teams to use. And yeah, and I think it'll be really telling like what you get back from that. And it could be something that you didn't initially think about or consider, because a lot of times the lived experiences of the people in the school building aren't even close to the same as the lived experiences of the students, of the families, of the community in which they're working. So yeah.
Okay, one more question for me, Alexandria. So it sounds like you utilized the walkthrough tool to collect some of that data. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm assuming to collect data on school-wide expectations. I think it's, like you had mentioned, really remarkable that first grade students were able to increase or improve that from like 40 or 50% to like 80%, if I'm remembering correctly. And I think that's pretty awesome. I'm just wondering, has there or are there any thoughts for you about touching base with, this school again, or reminders to reteach and, things like that, just to any follow-up research that you might have in mind to continue to support the work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so the context in which this study took place was that I was a practicum student at that site. And so I could, I had plans to go back the following year, and I was ready and like shared the results, and we were ready to go. And I was so excited. But unfortunately, at the last second, it was no longer a practicum site. So I couldn't do it. And just still being a student and a trainer, they're very, my program at least is very cautious of just like sending us like out into a school building again. And so versus I feel like if I was, an independent, practitioner or someone, like I definitely would have still maintained that relationship and followed through on that. So unfortunately, I couldn't do any follow-up. In hindsight, I have a lot of ideas of what I would do. And I did have a lot of plans of how I wanted to really use this data to transform is a bit aggressive, but just to, I guess, like enhance the PBIS implementation for this school. And I think it was just very telling to me of how important it is to be someone who is fully immersed, ingrained, and like committed to a school system to really get the change that needs to happen. And I get it's a limitation of being a student researcher, but it was just it was a good learning lesson for me, because I was like, of course I'll come back here and we'll do all these amazing things. And then they told me no. But yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I do think that's an important piece. Like you can come in and do something like this, and it's like, it's a starting point. And then in my mind, like that follow up, like that follow through is where real meaningful change can happen. And so if you're able to do this and have this be as part of your fall activities, like I said, like in September, you're going through the personal matrix activity with all of the classrooms at all grade levels, and then finding time as a PBIS leadership team to really think about, how might this inform how we teach our behavior expectations if we're not ready to change them and things like that. So yeah, I think all of that follow-up work is just so necessary and so needed. And it would be really great to know the different outcomes that can come from that, especially from a research perspective. But yeah.
And Alexandria, this is Mary. I have a question. So do you have any like couple pearls of wisdom or suggestions for any schools that want to either tackle doing a home matrices or a community one with their students and parents?
Yes, I'd say like expect the unexpected. It's kind of a cliche, but it's true. Like some of the responses the kids said, I was like, oh, okay, now we have to address that. And then I'd also think about, if you want it to be at the class-wide level, like I had it, or if you would want individual students to just write it out themselves. Just with being first grade classrooms, I just thought it would be best if I just sat at the front of the classroom and wrote down where everyone can see the different responses the kids were calling out. But I also think it's just so critical. And I know I've said this before, but I just think it can get really tricky sometimes. I know we have these things in society where, or even in like our own schools, that are norms. So I think a common one is keeping your hands and your feet to yourself, recognizing that that's not the reality in some homes and some communities. And that's not to say that, oh, that's so bad, that's so wrong that you can like punch someone or kick someone. Just knowing that it's different and acknowledging like that's the reality for these people, or for these families or these communities or whatever. And that can be in conflict with your own family, your own community, but that doesn't make yours better or yours worse, or theirs better or theirs worse. It's just different. And I think that's just so critical when doing an activity like this, because differences will come out, but also similarities will come out. And so it was just interesting because some people were like, oh yeah, I can punch my brother. And everyone's like, no, you can't. You can't punch your brother. I'm like, well, some people in their homes, maybe they can punch their brother. At school, though, we just keep our hands and feet to ourselves and like explain why and things like that. So that's kind of how I modeled it, and yeah, tried to acknowledge that for some people, no, like we can't say like that doesn't happen or it's wrong for that to happen. So yeah, I just be mindful of that if you're doing this as a school.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just looking for any last minute raised hands, and we'll leave it open here again for another minute if people have questions, and I will turn it back over here in a second, I just wanted to say thank you so much on behalf of the Department of Education and the Summer Institute for being here, Alexandria. We really appreciate all of the work you've done and continue to do with us in collaboration, and the work you've done with this culturally responsive field guide, just to have the personal and local experience to bring and very intentional work around the classroom and getting some positive results and outcomes for students and schools is wonderful. So we just want to thank you again. Look forward to doing more work with you, and we'll be in touch. And again, if there are any other questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.